Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallama ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So last week we began this important session on terminology of Hadith. And just by way of quick review, we looked at a few things. We looked at the requirements that scholars laid out for receiving hadith and delivering hadith, from input and output, from the perspective of input and the perspective of output. We're going to continue our discussion on hadith learning, and it's something very, very basic. It applies to everything, not just hadith. So there are 8 ways that scholars have laid out, 8 ways of learning hadith. And again, these are universal principles. You can apply them to all knowledge in general. So to understand these ways of learning hadith, one is samara or audition, another is recital. Before that, I wanted to lay the groundwork. So I'm going to use the blackboard for a moment. We had a new blackboard installed. I'm trying to get accustomed to all this technology. So you need to ask yourself important questions. One of the important questions is, what is knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? Where do we get knowledge from? Okay, let me just stop sharing the screen. One moment. Bear with me. Okay, so an important question that arises, what are the sources of knowledge? So there's a verse I want all of you to think about and look at. And if one of you can look up the verse for me, I'll write it on the board. It's chapter 16, verse 78. And I do have a wireless mic, so I can hold this and even walk around. So someone pull up the verse 16, verse 78 of chapter 16. And the online students, let me see if the camera can follow me. I believe so, yes. Okay, so someone read that verse to me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are 3 portions of this verse. The first one, and I know there's some glare in the online audience, so this is the best we can do for now. The camera does follow me. It's a cool camera I got. It follows me around wherever I go. But this board has a lot of glare. We made a mistake buying a glass board. So this verse, the first thing Allah says, Wallahu akhrajakum min butuni ummahatikum. Allah is the one who extracted you from the wombs of your mothers. Okay? And then the next thing he says, La ta'lamuna shay'a. You did not know anything. Well, you did not know anything. So this is a lack of knowledge, or absence of knowledge. So you're born from the wombs of your mothers with 0 knowledge. La ta'lamuna shay'a. Allah says that. This is an important verse. If you want to know the sources of knowledge, what knowledge is, how we achieve knowledge, all the answers are in the Quran. We just have to dig. We just have to ponder. We have to reflect. So this verse, so when you have a verse like this, La ta'lamuna shay'a, and then Allah builds you up. And He says what? وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ. What's next? And then He gave you. What's the first thing? Okay. Musa, you got the verse? Okay. Read me the exit because I have to write it out. I need to hear it clearer. As-sama. Okay. Is there a ta marbuta at the end? No. This as-sama. Okay. Wal. Okay. Wal absara. Wal afida. And then at the end, so He gave you 3 things. And then at the end, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, what does that mean? So that you may be grateful. Amazing verse here that's teaching you so many things. So first, it's teaching you that we're not born with knowledge. We're born with the absence, lack of knowledge. And then Allah gives us certain things. وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ, He made for you certain things in order for you to be grateful. So the end of the verse teaches you the purpose of knowledge. The purpose of knowledge in Islam is simply just one thing, tashkurun, so shukr. So you may attain shukr, right? So the purpose of knowledge is that you may attain gratitude. That's the purpose of life. That's the purpose of, why Allah created us on this earth, to worship Him. But what's the essence of worship? To being grateful to Allah, right? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. So we start with no knowledge, and we attain knowledge, and the goal is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. How do we attain knowledge? The answer will be right here. وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ, Allah gave you three things. What's sama? Hearing. Abasara? Sight. Afida? Hearts. It's the heart. So there's three things here. So the first two things are an allusion to the five senses. Allah doesn't have to mention everything, but when He says hearing and sight, He means those physical senses that Allah blessed us with. Allah gave us the capacity to experience five senses. There's hearing, where you hear sounds, and that's how we learned the Quran. The Quran was revealed through audio, through sound. The Prophet recited the Quran. He didn't hand out pages to people. That's important to know. And Jibreel came and recited to the Prophet ﷺ, and he recited to the people, and they heard it with their ears. And that's how it was transmitted. So hearing, then you have sight. Sight, you see things. Allah gave us all vision. We see things, we experience things. And then the other senses, like touch and smell and so on and so forth. So Allah gave us five senses. So that's an illusion. He's teaching us. He gave us these physical senses, the capacity to experience things, and that's how one of the ways we're going to attain knowledge. But then He also adds afida. Is afida a sense? What is afida?
Emotions, feelings.
What is it?
Emotions in our heart.
Yeah, so afida, literally, what does it mean? It's the fu'ad. Fu'ad in Arabic is the heart. Yeah, so the mind, the heart, that's an interesting, deep issue, the qalb. So in Islam, it's only qalb. And sometimes Allah says fu'ad. But it's the same reality, it's just sometimes describing different aspects of that reality. So the heart is how we experience emotions, how the heart is a commander of the body. We're going to look at Arba'in today. One of the hadith will be about the heart. But the heart is how we think. It's interesting. The Quran says, "Am lahum qulubun la ya'qiluna biha." Do they not have hearts that they think? So there's no such thing as the mind and the heart separate in Islam. In Islam, it's one thing. So the heart the heart is very different from what we feel like. So it's something very deep and something very complex. It's from the ghaibiyat, but Allah says He blessed us with these qulub, the hearts. The heart is mahallun niyyah. The first hadith we looked at, innamal a'malu binniyat. Right? That's the niyyah is your motive. Where is your motive? It's here in your heart, more than your mind. Your mind is also part of the heart. It has some type of connection, but it's really the heart. When you resolve to do something, like I am going to class today, even though it's raining and a lot of people didn't. But all of you that came here today, the few of you that came here today, you made that intention. It was your heart driving you. If it was just your mind and your heart wasn't there, you wouldn't have done it. So in Islam, the qalb is the commander of the body. But anyway, what Allah is meaning to say here, He blessed us with this fu'ad. When Allah uses fu'ad, it's more emotional. It's that inner heart, the inner sense. Like when Musa's mother put Musa in the water, right? وَأَصْبَحَ فُؤَادُ أُمِّ مُوسَى فَارِغًا. Allah used fu'ad rather than qalb because He's talking about the heart of a mother when she had to separate from the child. So the heart, the fu'ad, is an emotional heart. It's the center of something. How is that related to knowledge? What do you think? How would that be related to knowledge? You have the physical senses, so you see things, you realize some. We're looking at sources of knowledge from this verse. So you see things, or you touch things. A child will touch fire and experience burn, and they attain the knowledge that this is something you stay away from. This is something that burns, that harms. That's the senses. That's making you gain knowledge, and experience the world around you. But what about the fu'ad? How does the fu'ad fit in there in terms of the knowledge? Hmm. Okay. Hmm. It's even more basic than that. Um, so more basic than that is, what did Allah create within us that helps us find the truth? Huh? Fitra. So that's the fitra. Fitra is the imprint that Allah placed within us that allows us to recognize the truth. So there's this inner sense that also helps us attain knowledge. So there's external. So these are external here, right? So these, let me change the color here. So if you break down the tools Allah gives us to gain knowledge, you have external senses, right? Right here, these are external, and then you have an internal source or internal way of attaining knowledge. That's your heart. That's the fitrah. Fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nasa alayha. This is the fitrah, the natural sense or the imprint, the nature, the inner nature that Allah created all mankind with. And that's how we recognize the truth. So in Islam, you have sources of knowledge are, so you have, I would have to erase there. Anybody still writing? It's a verse. Everyone has a verse. It's Surah Al-Nahl, verse 78, right? Okay, so I'm going to erase this. So in another way of looking at it is, what are the direct, so this is a verse that helps build this understanding, what knowledge is, what are the sources of knowledge. So another way of looking at this information is, what are the exact sources of knowledge, right? More practically speaking. So you have sources of knowledge are sources of knowledge. You have external and internal. External are the five senses through which we experience the world. Internal is that fitra, or that heart. I'll just put fitra. That's something very, very important in Islam. So this is one way of looking at the sources of knowledge, right? And we got that from the verse. Now, another way of looking at how we attain knowledge is that you have reality, right? I'll use a different color and I'll put it on the side. You have reality, haqa'iq, haqiqa, or the realities of the universe, right? Allah created this world. How do we understand this world? So again, there are two ways. One is through the five senses, right? You experience the world through the senses, al-hawas in Arabic. And the other is revelation. So Allah reveals to you information about the world. So and the five senses is how you experience the world, right? So that's another way of looking. There are many ways of looking at this whole equation, okay? Now, relating it all to hadith. Okay, how do you relate it to hadith? So in terms of hadith, so hadith is basically, what is hadith related to? The senses or revelation? Revelation, good. So hadith is communication from the Messenger of Allah ﷺ on behalf of Allah. Whether he gives us a revelation of Allah through the Quran came through the medium of the Messenger, or he tells us about the universe. He tells us, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. He tells us how to worship him. He gives us all types of information. So the Quran and the Sunnah fall under revelation. So now, how do me and you experience revelation? So that's important because that's where hadith fits in, and that's why you understand this whole the usul al hadith. So, did the Quran come to any of you? Did Allah deliver the Quran? Did Jibreel give you the Quran? No. And innamal a'malu binniyat. We learned that hadith. Who gave us this hadith? Imam Nawawi came to us and gave us that hadith? No. Did the Prophet ﷺ come to us in a dream and tell us those statements? No. So, how do we attain that information? Okay. Through the narrators, simply narrators. Okay, so basically, revelation, how does revelation work? Allah reveals through the medium of an angel, or sometimes directly through a chosen person in the world. Now, that person is tasked to spread that message to others, right? So now, revelation so in any reality, you have a first-hand witness. It's called shuhud or shahid. And then you have non-first-hand witness, you have reporters. So a first-hand witness tells you about something that happened. So another person would experience or get to experience that same level of knowledge or understand that same thing. So I like to share I usually teach in college for YM Study Circle. That's where we, a couple of years we had this discussion. So I asked the audience and I'll ask you on 9/11, September 11th, how many of you saw the World Trade Center fall? Many of us did. How many did not? So there are many people here that did not, right? So those who did not, can we say they don't know what happened? Like, if Musa tells me or tells someone about what happened that day, would he be at fault? But how did he attain that information? Through someone who was there. So you have someone that experiences at ground zero, first-hand witness, shahid, and then you have ruwat. Then you transmit that information to others. And then they transmit that information to others, and the level goes on and on. So, in that sense, to have a truly sound source of knowledge, all these levels have to be there. The revelation has to be sound, there has to be a first-hand witness, and there has to be someone who heard that first-hand witness. And then there has to be someone who heard that person. And that person, someone who heard that person, or whether in writing or hearing, until it reached us today. If there's a missing link anywhere in the chain, then you have no idea if this whole system is sound or not. Is your chain of command sound to the source, right? So that's basically where knowledge fits in the Usul al-Hadith, where the scholars of Hadith, they looked at things very logically. This is what you apply to all knowledge, right? Today, instead of reporters or the Rawi, we have reporters, which are the newspapers, right? So a newspaper or a journalist would record through a video camera or see the event and describe it to you in the nightly news. You know, there's so many people here, there's chaos, there's smoke, and then other people hear it. And then that gets preserved. And maybe 20 years later, somebody would look up that and hear and try to understand. So basically, you got knowledge of that event through a reporter. That's really what hadith is. It's basically, ground zero is the companions, where the Prophet ﷺ is training them, teaching them, inspiring them. And basically, okay, my online students, were you hearing me? I think my setup, I think I forgot to take the other mic. Okay, so coming back to our class, so I wanted to build that base just to have you understand that this is a very logical process. Based upon this, now you can understand this discussion, the 8 ways of receiving hadith, okay? And for the online, let me get the slides back for you. One moment. No, that was not right. Okay. So, what's the first or the strongest way or of receiving knowledge, according to scholars? Something called sama'. Audition is a fancy word, but it means hearing. You can put down direct hearing. So, this is the most authentic form of learning for Hadith scholars, where applying this to Hadith, and you can also apply it to knowledge, but in Hadith or transmitting revelation, it means you heard your teacher recite the hadith directly or whatever source of information that they're transmitting. So this is the most authentic form of knowledge, where you're sitting in front of a teacher and that teacher is transmitting to you what they heard from their teacher. And it has to apply to every level. That teacher must have heard from the voice of his teacher, from the voice of his teacher, going back to a companion who relates to you, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Okay? وهو على المنبر يقول إنما الأعمال بالنيات. For example. So this samara is called, in Arabic, as samara min lafz al-shaykh. So when scholars looked at reporters, right, when they looked at people saying, oh, I heard Sufyan say this, first thing I would ask them, okay, did you hear Sufyan say that? Were you sitting there and you, so if they said yes, then check mark, right? So now at the first level, there's a sound transmission. You actually heard Sufyan say that. You actually heard Imam Malik say that. So that's fits sama'. But then they have to apply that to every level, going back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right now, we're just looking at the level of the student of hadith. Okay, one of the strongest methods of learning is this idea of sama', of hearing from a teacher. So this is even stronger for some scholars than reading a book, right? So today we're accustomed to reading books. Can I finish the idea, and then we'll take the questions, inshallah. So it's even stronger than reading from a book. From reading from a book, for instance, there are many things you will not learn there are many things you learn from a teacher, from his tone, from his mannerism, from his the way he's saying the statement. You cannot convey emotion in a book, right? Now, ask yourself this. There are many things that the Prophet ﷺ said. Some of them were so serious, and some of them were not so serious. How do you know that from reading hadith? It's hard to know that. How do you know that from reading a book, right? There's some hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, they're so serious that everyone in the audience has tears in their eyes. And every word that's coming out of the Prophet's mouth is momentous. But then there are other things the Prophet said, like, for instance, A'maru ummati ma bayna sittin wa sab'in. Most of my people will live to 60 to 70 years old. Few of them will exceed that age. That's not a momentous teaching. That's not a core teaching of the faith. That's just something the Prophet must have said in passing. It's not a major teaching. And there are many hadith like that are not major teachings. So the companions, they knew because they were there. But then sometimes when we read books, we miss a lot of that information. So we're just trying to apply this to our level, the student-teacher level, right, at our immediate level. But immediately, most scholars would say that samar is the most strongest form of learning, not just reading a book, but hearing the information from the teacher directly. And that's what they looked at when they looked at these reporters. How do you know that a certain hadith reporter heard the information? So this most authentic form of learning is conveyed through certain clues, right? Okay. I didn't want to get ahead. You're going to get distracted. Let me just pause here then. So one of the ways is the hadith reporter will say, "Sami'tu Sufyan ibn Uyayna yaqul." I heard Sufyan say. When you see a word "sami'tu," I heard, and there's no confusion there. There's no. Then you know that there's samara. There's this element of hearing, right? That's the strongest chain of command. This inspires confidence in the accuracy of the message. Then you have to take that all the way up the chain, okay? But sometimes we see, people say, or like Hassan al-Basri would say,
عن أبي هريرة عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Hassan al-Basri often said from Abu Huraira, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he said this. Now you're not sure, did he actually hear Abu Huraira or not? Because Hassan al-Basri rarely heard the companions. He didn't spend a lot of time sitting and learning from companions because he was part of their household. So, you have to kind of, like when you look at these reporters and you look at this information, it's historical, right now it's historical information. You have to determine, did this person hear from that person or not? And sometimes the language will give you clues that the person did hear. Sometimes it's explicit, like sami'tu, but sometimes it's not explicit. It might be akhbarani Sufyan. Sufyan informed me. That kind of tells you that that is fairly explicit. But how did he inform him? Was it through a classroom? Was it through a message, like a letter? Was it through some other source? So sami'tu is the strongest, most reliable form in transmission of hadith when you use the word sami'tu. Cannot be mistaken for other than direct hearing. So although other scholars sometimes they did not use that term, they'll use other terms that are more ambiguous. So the point here for us, the most authentic form of learning is audition or hearing. You can apply that to your children. Children who sit in a classroom, like with COVID, we realized when the classroom wasn't there, how did our kids suffer, right? They didn't see the teacher. They weren't in the classroom. They weren't live, face to face. They were behind screens. Behind the screens, what kind of attention did the kids have? Was it 100%? It was probably less than 50% because there's so many distractions. You have a screen here. Like, look at me. I have a Zoom audience, right? Today we have more Zoom students than online students. And I keep forgetting they're there. And I keep focusing on you guys because you're here. And I go to the board and I came back and I realized I didn't even pick up the mic that's connected to the Zoom. So online is not the same as in person. And that's the same idea. Sama', direct hearing, is the most authentic form of learning. Even books, today people are accustomed to books. Books are the most authentic form, but books contain mistakes. How many books have mistakes? So many books out there have mistakes. And you can never learn that unless you're sitting with a teacher. And that's why, look at the mistake we saw even in the Arba'in, nutfatan. It's a mistake that's in all the printed editions or most of the printed editions of the Arba'in. How will you know that? Unless you're reading and accustomed to learning from teachers. That's the whole point here. Sama'a is the most authentic form of receiving hadith, okay? And generally the most authentic form of learning. Number two after that would be recital. Or you had a question on Sama'a? Mm. Like Samara today, like in Chains today? Right, right. So, okay, that's a good question. I think we might be covering it later. But right now I want to build everyone's base. Like we're looking at the strongest methods of learning, hadith, and this is applied to that classical era. Because now when scholars are analyzing hadith, they're going to look at every reporter. Did this person hear from this person? And just I want you all to understand that hearing is more sound and more authentic form of transmission and learning than other forms. But once I go through all the forms, then we'll talk about how they apply today, perhaps, inshallah. Second form is recital, qira'ah. More specifically, it's called al-qira'atu ala shaykh, reciting to a teacher. So you can say samara is where you hear the teacher, like you're hearing me give you the lesson today. And qira'ah is where you would sit with the teacher and recite something to the teacher while the teacher listens and corrects, like you do with the Quran. That's how you learn Quran primarily, right? You sit and you recite to the teacher. If I just recite to you and sit and just recite, here, learn the Quran from me, I recite the whole Quran beginning to end, and you listen to it, it's a little bit different, right? Does that ensure that you're able to recite the same way? No. So qira'ah is also very useful and very valuable in Quran as well as Hadith. So this is more student oriented. The Samara is more teacher oriented. Okay. So in Hadith, how does that apply in Hadith? So, if you can't hear Hadith from a teacher, then the second form that scholars recognize was that at least you read those Hadith to the teacher, and that teacher would correct you. Then you can say, I heard this, or I received this Hadith from that particular teacher. There was as always, there's a difference of approaches. So the people of Kufa, the people of Damascus, Syria, they were more accustomed to hearing from teachers. Okay, they felt that hearing was superior to recital. Okay, but the people of Medina, for instance, their approach to learning was to recite to a teacher. So how does that play out? So it plays out, who's the main teacher in Medina from the classical era? Imam Malik. Imam Malik was Imam Daru Ahl Sunnah, Darul Hijrah, Imam Darul Hijrah. He was the great Imam of Medina. So how would he teach the Muwatta, his hadith work? He would sit there and scholars would come, or students rather would come, and they would purchase copies of the Muwatta from the market, or they would write out the hadith themselves, and they would recite those hadith in these sessions to Imam Malik, and he would correct them. That was his style, and that was perfectly valid. But the people of Kufa and the people of Damascus, they didn't like this style so much. They believed that we had to hear from the teacher. So who came from Kufa to study? The famous person who came and studied with Imam Malik? Imam Shafi was from Mecca, so yes, Imam Shafi also. But Imam Shafi would be from Mecca. Mecca and Medina is the same thing. But someone famously came from Kufa, and this melded the Kufan school and the Medinan school to some extent. That's a link. No. No, Ahmad ibn Muhammad was from Baghdad. Okay. He came much later.
Abu Hanifa?
Yes, so not Abu Hanifa, but the best student of Abu Hanifa.
Abu Yusuf.
Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. Abu Yusuf was number 2. So Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani there are 2 great students of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. So Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani came to Medina to study with Imam Malik. And he was a companion of Abu Hanifa. That's how close Malik and the eras were. Muhammad ibn Hassan was a person who was a teacher of Shafi'i. Shafi'i first studied with Malik, and then he wanted to go study with Abu Hanifa, but Abu Hanifa had passed. So he wound up studying with Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Anyway, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani came and studied the Muwatta from Imam Malik, and he has a Muwatta today. So the Muwatta today, when you read the books of the Muwatta of Imam Malik, there's not one version. There are multiple versions depending on which student came and read the hadith with Imam Malik. There's slight variations between them. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan's, his style, as I said, he came from Kufa. They're accustomed to hearing from the teacher. So he asked Imam Malik to recite the hadith to him, and Imam Malik would oblige, but not every day. So because of that, he spent 3 whole years in Medina until he heard all the hadith from Imam Malik, because that was their methodology in Kufa. That's why his version of the Muwatta is very valuable. It's very valuable for a number of reasons. One, every hadith in the Muwatta, so it would say Al-Muwatta bi riwayat Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, but it'll say Muwatta Muhammad. So Muwatta through Muhammad, the student of, so it's translated in English. I should have brought a copy. So that's one of the more authentic versions of the Muwatta. There are almost 50, 60 versions of the Muwatta out there. So what's valuable for that is every hadith in that version of the Muwatta, Imam Muhammad heard from Imam Malik. And second, what's valuable is Imam Muhammad is coming from the Kufan school. He's Hanafi. He's a student of Abu Hanifa. So he differs with Imam Malik and agrees with him on some points. So they're very valuable after post-hadith comments that we learn a lot from. Okay. So this is just the reason I shared that with you, just to share with you 2 approaches. So they're both valid approaches. You can either hear from a teacher or you recite to a teacher. And different scholars had different approaches as to which one was better, the idea of which one was better. So generally in hadith circles, how does this play out? So either the teacher is sitting and relating their hadith. So Sufyan ibn Uyayna would relate hadith, and all the students are sitting there, they're writing the hadith down if the teacher is reading the hadith. And or the other way is if the books are well known, or the teacher already has compiled a book, or at least a working collection of hadith, then the students would get those hadith first from the manuscript shop, or write them out in advance. So a lot of these students would come to these scholars. They would go to the markets, either purchase the copies, or they were very expensive to purchase. So they would have their own reading material. So they would borrow someone's copy and just copy it out during the nights before getting to the lesson the next day with the scholar. So this second approach, then the student would have their copy and they would recite the entire copy of the hadith, or over a course of time to the teacher, and the teacher would correct. And there would be often mistakes. When you copy hadith, you would make mistakes. The teacher's job is to hear the hadith and say, no, this is wrong, this word is wrong. So they would correct that. And once you're done getting all the hadith through your copy, then the teacher will sign that copy, and that becomes an authentic manuscript. You wrote these hadith down as a student, but you read all of them to your teacher, and the teacher signed off at the end of your copy that this student, he heard all these hadith from me accurately. And that becomes a manuscript that later scholars rely on to create their own versions of books and manuscripts, okay? So the important point here is two ways of receiving knowledge, okay? Now, how does that play out? I shared, we have a teacher's training course. I shared an interesting opinion. And so there's an idea, okay, hearing from a teacher or reading to a teacher, what if the teacher is behind a wall? Scholars discuss that as well. And you don't actually see the teacher. Is that valid? What do you think? So imagine, so can you learn from a teacher you cannot see? Why? Yes. So Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. The Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, they would teach from فَاسْأَلُوهُنَّ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَابٍ, as the Quran says. Ask them from behind a curtain. So they would teach from behind a curtain. So, and they taught the whole ummah. People would come and learn hadith from Aisha. She's one of the most prolific narrators of hadith. So all the hadith of Aisha are learned two ways. So one of the ways is Aisha's own relatives, they learn from her directly because they don't have to go behind the curtain. They go into the inner chamber. People like Abdullah ibn Zubayr, her nephew, Al-Qasim ibn Urwa ibn Zubayr, her other nephew, and female narrators, Amra bint Abdurrahman. So they had exclusive access. So their hadith are more valuable because they didn't have to be in the public setting behind the curtain. They would go behind, and they would learn even more than the people sitting outside. But everyone else learned as well. So these are like intricacies you have to be aware of. But at the same time, okay, that's the mothers of the believers. That's exclusive for them. What about others? Like, can you learn? So generally in learning, like the teacher has to know the student, and the student has to know the teacher. The main idea in establishing this chain of command in hadith is you have to know who each person was and whether he heard the report from the person before him. If you're unknown and you're wearing a mask, for instance, can you imagine some scenarios where things can happen, right? Suppose you go to a city and you hear someone teaching from the next room and you just sit there and write hadith. Is there chances of problems happening? Of course there is. So that wasn't preferred to teach from behind a barrier. It was only for the women or for the mothers of the believer. So Imam Shu'bah was a very strict hadith scholar. He's one of the strictest hadith experts. So he said something interesting that I was thinking about with my Zoom audience. Like, I hate teaching online, right? All the years we've been teaching, I've never taught online, all in person. I teach the same classes every year. Been teaching the same class the last 15 to 16 years, hadith, and then the tajweed even longer, because I couldn't record them, just make them available online, but that's not really learning because you're not hearing from the teacher and you're not. So there are plenty of video. What's the value of my videos going online when there's even better scholars online There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of hours of great scholars. Their videos are online, all their books are in the libraries, but do people actually access them? No. So just because you have a library with 100,000 books, does that mean everyone's going to read those books? No. So that's why learning is samar, this human element, this live interaction has to be there. So anyway, Shu'bah said something interesting. He said, إِذَا حَدَّثَكَ مَنْ لَا تَرَى شَخْصَهُ. If someone relates hadith to you whom you cannot see, فَلَا تَرْوِ عَنْهُ. Do not narrate from him or her. فَلَعَلَّهُ شَيْطَانٌ قَدْ تَصَوَّرَ فِي صُورَتِهِ يَقُولُ حَدَّثَنَا أَخْبَرَنَا. It could be shaitan who comes and assumes the shape of someone and says, I heard this or I heard that. So Shorba was very strict. So this is Avi Mubalagha, but the principle is sound. That's why for my online students, it's really annoying when all I see is like a Japanese anime as their profile picture, and that's who I'm talking to, right? Or someone else, or a cat, or something like that. I don't know who you are. I can't see you. So that's not real instruction. It's okay for this class, but for a deep diploma program, and where at the end of 2 years we want to certify everyone, we want to help you grow as students, we really have to have some personal connection. So one of the things people do on Zoom, they say, at least while you're talking, share your video, right? Because really, I mean, there's like 60 people online. I don't know who they are. I recognize some of the names, but some of them have their first name only, or Muhammad. There's a couple of Muhammads. Like, who is Muhammad? So, huh? No, anime is like a cartoon, like right? The cartoon characters, or I mean, I don't know. That's what we see. Like everyone's like profile picture is something, right? Either it's a letter or something. So, and it might be a scholar that they love. So a lot of times on Facebook, people have their profile picture of a great scholar that passed away, and sometimes they post something that looks like that scholar is saying it. So there's confusion that sets in on Facebook posts too, right? Or social media posts. I mean, young kids are saying, "What's Facebook?" But that's our generation. Yes, Shumal. Yes. Well, in the Western tradition, for sure, because that's the only, before the modernity, that was the only way in all traditions. Like Socrates, like the teachings of Socrates, where are they? Like when you read them, they're all his students who sat in his classes. It's their recollections of their conversations with their teacher. So the Platonic discourses and all. So it was always like that in every tradition. It's common sense. It's only so this kind of well, I have to complete the whole discussion, but it kind of changed with the accessibility of books. When the books came, then kind of this live element kind of died out. It got less important, but it never went away. There's always, and with the kids, like everyone's suffering. The kids are suffering because they have the textbooks, they have Zoom classes, but they're not live in front of a teacher. Now all these people are studying the adverse effects upon children of not having live instruction. That's what our hadith experts were saying. Samara is much more important, authentic form of learning than just like through like a screen or through a book. Okay. Now even books are dying now, but now it's so complicated. Now it's YouTube videos, but so is that Samara? It kind of is, and now at least you see the person saying something. So is that better than books or worse than books? Because like if you're listening to a scholar, for instance, you're listening to his own words. So in one sense, it's better than a book because you can hear his voice, and you can even see somewhat of his mannerisms. But in another sense, Allahu Alam, things are getting so complicated in modern life. But let's at least understand these basic principles, okay? Number 3, there are 3 strong methods. The third one, if there are any online students that have questions, you can also jump in. The third one, and oh, sorry. So online students, they see the whole slide, so they already saw everything. It's called ijaza. Out of the 3, this was the weakest form of learning, of classical learning. Ijaza is basically, what is ijaza? I mean, today everyone talks about ijaza. We just don't understand what it is. But ijaza is basically the loosest form of learning. It was questionable for many scholars. Many scholars did not accept it. Ibn Hazm referred to it as an impermissible innovation. Um, why? Because ijaza basically, when you in this scheme, ijaza means it's not probably what you're thinking of. Ijaza means where you did not hear the hadith from the teacher, you did not recite the hadith to the teacher. You only received ijaza, permission from the teacher. Okay, you can teach my hadith without hearing them, without reading them. Okay, so in that sense, it was heavily disputed by classical scholars. Most of them did not like it. Like they saw it as bypassing the system of learning that has, like, efficacy and barakah. And when ijaza started coming out early on, some of the scholars, they said, "Lo jazat al-ijaza labattalat al-rihla." If we allow ijaza, then the whole concept of going to teachers and traveling the Muslim world would die out. So can you imagine, like, look at Imam Bukhari, how he traveled the world. If you draw out his maps, it's incredible, the places he traveled by foot. Baqi ibn Makhlad from Spain to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. All these early scholars, Abu Hatim al-Razi, like, they travel just to find, sometimes for months, to find one hadith. So imagine you could just have permission, okay, everyone's allowed to teach hadith. Even the teacher gives permission to, like, is that the same as sitting and learning from a teacher? No, it's not. So ijaza basically means when you're getting permission from a teacher. I mean, it's not, it still has value because the teacher is giving you permission. It's like kind of like a license issued to, like, trusted individuals. But you didn't actually learn that material from the teacher. So that's why it's not that valuable, although today people talk about it a lot, but it's very loose. It's a loose form of learning, okay? And what are some of the ways that you learn that these are the, so here are some terms. So this is important. The terms that you recognize, sama'a, you can say, see, sami'tu an, or sami'na, haddathani, haddathana, or the teacher reported to me, akhbarani, akhbarana, anba'ani, anba'ana, or qala lana, dhakara lana. These are all different forms of transmission. So as a hadith student, when you're looking at biography, looking at isnads, these are the terms you'll find in front of the narrators. When you see sami'tu, is very strong, but it's not that common. But more common is haddathana, akhbarana, anba'ana. There it's a little more vague. Haddathana, okay, we're not really 100% sure. Is the person read the hadith or hear the hadith? So there's a little more ambiguity. Qira'ah is denoted by terms such as qara'tu ala shaykh, or haddathana shaykh qira'atan alayhi, or I read to the shaykh, or I heard the shaykh reported me through my reading to him, qira'atan alayhi. So these are terms that you'll find in the isnad terms, or akhbarana qira'atan alayhi. Ijaza is just like, ajaztu lak. I have given you ijaza. I give you ijaza in this book. I give you ijaza, or ajizukum biha. I give you ijaza in this or that. It could be anything. So these are just the terms. So these are your three basic forms of transmitting hadith, and you can also apply them to general learning. And this is their gradation. So with that, I can take some questions. Yes, go ahead, Danielle. Oh, why ijaza? Basically, why would it be there? Kind of. So basically, good question. So why? So I get the question basically is why ijaza? Why would scholars allow ijaza? Well, a lot of them didn't, but why did it exist as a phenomenon? It's really easy to understand. Like, imagine. So look, you're studying Arba'in with me, right? We're at hadith number what? 4. And that's 40. We're having a tough time like visualizing whether we're going to finish the 40 this semester or not. Imagine we were studying the Muwatta. Imagine we were studying Sahih al-Bukhari, 9,000. This is 40. Imagine 9,000 or 6,000. Imagine the Musnad Imam Ahmad, 30,000 hadith. Imagine studying that. How much time do you need? Like you need a semester for 40 hadith. For Sahih al-Bukhari, you need 20 to 30 years. How many people have time for that? So it's not practical. So because of practicality, what scholars did was when a student learned certain things from them, they're like, look, I respect you. I have confidence in you that you learn from me, or the methodology is sound. You learn maybe 100 hadith from me. Here's ijazah and the other 10,000. We don't have time to read them all. And then some scholars did read them all, but like Sufyan ibn Uyayna had like a couple thousand students in his class at one time. So every single person, these teachers had hundreds of thousands of students. Does that mean hundreds of thousands of people were able to read the entire Muwatta to Imam Malik? That's not possible. It's not humanly possible. So ijazah was like a way out where it still preserved some knowledge, it preserved this idea of transmission, but it was still heavily contested, right? So it wasn't like universally accepted early on. Mustafa? No, he was pre-Imam Bukhari. He was born in the hundreds of the Hijrah. So I mean, they were circulating hadith, but they weren't the Muwatta wasn't a book at that time. I mean, Imam Malik was teaching it, but he was very early. It was prior to the canonization. So the question is, Imam Abu Hanifa, he lived prior to the canonization of hadith. So how does that relate to his fiqh? So you have to understand, what is canonization? Canonization is not like the Western Orientalists presume that hadith were written down 300 years after the Prophet ﷺ, so we can't trust it. Canonization was just a collection of what was out there. Those hadiths were there. You think prior to Imam al-Bukhari, people didn't know those hadith? Those hadith, where did Imam Bukhari get them? He didn't invent them. He got them from his teachers. Those teachers were there. Imam Bukhari's teachers were the teachers of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa had like some of the early figures of hadith as teachers. So he was very, very solid. So these hadith were circulating. So canonization does not mean the hadith were invented or the books came out for the first time. It means these are the hadith that are already being taught in all the centers around the world. They're already well known to scholars, and they were like basically just documented in a more easier way, documented in specific books. So now instead of going to a teacher, sitting down, reading 100,000 hadith, you already have. So Imam Malik was the first one who did that. The first book of hadith compiled in our tradition is the Muwatta. Imam Malik, the reason he did that, because he had so many students, he just wanted to create a coherent, what do you call like the handouts you give to your students, right? Binders. The Muwatta was Imam Malik's binder for his students. So he already had in his mind the hadith he wanted to teach over the course of his lifetime that he learned in various chapters. He compiled them, and he would just teach those to his students, and they were already there. And in Medina, you could get copies of those. So he had the binder already set. That was the Muwatta. It was a register of Imam Malik's hadith. Every teacher started doing the same. Sufyan al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, they started doing the same, because they were teaching the same hadith again and again. Like I teach the same class over the years, so I have everything on the slide. So the teachers would do the same. They would write them down. They had these copies, so they would just bring out their copy and start reading. When they're done, they go back to page 1, and then the student wanted the copy. They would give the copy to the student. Here, copy them. Student would sit down and transcribe all the hadith. So that's what the books were early on. And then later on, books became more and more popular and then became canonized. Canonized just means a couple of books became more popular than the others. It doesn't mean there were new books or that information wasn't already there. Wallahu alam. Yes, can I get some sisters? Any sisters have questions? Anyone online? I don't miss anybody. Yes.
In the relevance of today's world, like, isn't ijaza kind of something that you can look more to? Because, for example, if you're looking to study from a teacher, like, how can you just, no one says, well, I heard this, like, they list out the ijazas, for example. So how practical is this in us as students?
Yeah, so this is applying to the classical era. So this doesn't apply to us today. It applies to us today in general ways, like we talked about the children and learning online and things like that, and the difference between Zoom students and Insight students. So we can still learn some valuable insights, but this is not the pathway that we're going to progress like necessarily in our life because it's a different world now. So, but still at the same time, I want people to realize it's still hearing a teacher is the most authentic form of learning directly, live, face to face, much stronger than the other forms. But does that mean that's what we have to do? No, we can't. We simply cannot. We can't afford to. But then you said ijaza would be more. I mean, there are 8 ways. I just gave you 3. There's a lot of others that are more applicable today. So I guess we'll save that answer till later on. The other issue with ijaza today has become slightly different. Like this is the classical era. So now scholars are trying to establish that chain of command. Whether this person heard from this person and he received ijaza, what does that mean? Later on, it became very loose. It became looser and looser. And now today it's just a tradition. It's just like a custom. It has very little value. So ijaza today, what does ijaza mean today? Although we give ijaza in our institute, I mean, there are 2 broad approaches. One is that it's still something that we still hold on to, and the other is it's entirely useless. And I'm more inclined to the entirely useless camp, although I still do it, but it's basically, it doesn't mean much. It really, really doesn't mean much. Because the ijazas today, all they are just ijazas in hadith. The teacher waves, you have ijaza, and then they use them to boost their egos. I have ijaza from so and so. What does that mean? Like, that's not really. So ijaza doesn't mean that you sat with the teacher for 20 years. That's something different. That means that's your companion, that's your teacher. You're the main student of that teacher. That's different from getting ijaza. Ijaza is basically you sat with someone for a period of time. Sometimes it's hours. A lot of these ijazas, 1 hour or 5 minutes even. I mean, wallahi ladhim, it's 5 minutes. You meet a scholar, you sit 5 minutes, get ijaza, and then becomes part of your resume. You go around, have ijaza from this sheikh. So there's no effort required, and they're just granted without any learning. So Ahmad Muhammad Shakir was a great hadith scholar from the past century. Ahmad Shakir. So he expressed, and he wrote in the early 1900s. So he expressed his whole reservations about the ijaza culture. He felt that it weakened the institution of learning. And he said what did he say? He said, حتى صارت في الأعصر الأخيرة رسم يرسم لا علما يتلقى ويؤخذ. He said ijaza today has become, in our times, just a culture, just a tradition that people hold on to, not any knowledge that people acquire or attain in a real way. So for him, it was very, very questionable. So anyway, we'll have more to say about the topic of ijaza. With that, there's some chapters you should read that touch upon what we talked about. Chapter number 13 of this book, Foundation to Hadith Science, is about Sama'a and Qira'ah, hearing hadith and reading hadith. So read chapter 13 and 14. 14 is the meaning of ijaza. So you'll get a better explanation than I can give you. So 13 and 14 is a reading for this week based upon what we did. How are we doing on time? Okay. Let me quickly do the rest of the ways of receiving hadith. So we have presentation or munawala. Okay, munawala was basically, what is munawala? Munawala is where a teacher presents their book to the teacher and says, "Here, you can take my hadith." Um, so there's no reading, there's no samara, and generally there's no ijaza. If there was ijaza, there would be considered ijaza. So generally, a teacher just gives his book to a student, right? Um, and sometimes he'll say, "You have permission to teach my book." So that's just like a presentation. It's like a transference. Sometimes it's with ijaza, sometimes without. So it's a looser form of transmitting knowledge. Okay. Um, so scholars, when they look at Manawa, they see, okay, was there an ijaza accompanied with it? Did the teacher specifically say his intent was for you to transmit this from me? Or was it just giving it to you? So that's a much weaker form. It's heavily debated. All these on this side will be much weaker. Then you have mukataba. Mukataba is where it's from kitab, writing, correspondence. So this is where a teacher gives you hadith by writing through a letter or through like a fatwa, or you write a letter to a teacher and it gives you ijaza in certain hadith. So again, this was heavily disputed. Ahmad Shakir, he considered it sound. He said because if it's in writing, it's a little more reliable than munawala. And there are many examples. So how did it play out in the classical era? There are a handful of hadith that Imam al-Bukhari received through writing, correspondence from a scholar, and he included them in the Sahih. So it was something that scholars relied upon. It wasn't huge, but it was. Same thing with Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen. What did she do? People all around the world would write to her for fatwa, and she would write back. So when she writes an answer back, and even with something she heard from the Prophet ﷺ, would that be reliable or not? Of course it would be. Even though it's not face to face, it's not in person. So that's why mukataba is still a great form of knowledge. So it played out in the classical era with the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. It played out for Imam al-Bukhari. It wasn't the primary way, but it's one of the ways. And even there was a famous female companion, Sumayya al-Asnawiya. She's the one who famously narrated the hadith of the Iddah period after a woman's husband dies. So most scholars around the world received this hadith from her through mukataba, her students, from her writing a letter. So not everyone could come to Medina to learn from the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, but they would write letters and she would often write back to them. So mukataba is very, very important. Number 6, i'lam. I'lam is declaration. So this is a teacher simply declaring that this is my book. I received it from this teacher. And it's less direct. It's not like the teacher is giving it to you, where the teacher is giving you the book. That would be munawala. It's not an ijaza. The teacher says, I give you permission to relate these hadith from me. But it's just al-i'lam, informing. The teacher informed, I received these hadith from Imam Ahmad. Do you have the permission to take those hadith and teach them? So that would be heavily debated. Qadi Iyad, Ibn Salah considered this entirely invalid. Other scholars, they looked at it, well, maybe if the teacher-student has a great relationship and you're sitting in class, you're learning from that teacher anyway, then we would accept it. So i'lam was a lesser form. These aren't that major. The major form is samar, qira, ijaza, and then much lesser degree mukataba. But these are rare forms, thankfully. And then finally, number 7, there's 8, wasiya. Al-wasiyatu bil-kitab or bil-kutub. This is a will. This is where a teacher upon death, he leaves instructions that I want this student to teach my book or my hadith, my collection of hadith. So this was considered very weak for most scholars, like Ibn Salah. Ahmad Shakir, he considered it okay because he felt it was equivalent to ijaza if the teacher specified it, even though it was discovered after his death because it's a wasiyah, then it's still valid for them. So, it was contested. And finally, the last one, and these are in the order of magnitude, the weakest form of learning was discovery. Discovery is what? You come across a book in a library and, or you come across a book, buried somewhere. That happens all the time, right? That's how we find manuscripts today. In these archaeological digs around the world, in Spain, whenever they like redo the houses, a lot of because in Spain the Muslim culture was buried, right? So a terrible tragedy. Entire Muslim civilization just was like forcibly converted and killed. So what did they do? They buried their books within the walls. And now, when people are redoing their houses, these treasures are coming out. These books are coming out. There's hundreds of thousands of um, copies of Quran and books of Hadith that are being unearthed, and they're just donated to the libraries in Madrid, and the government in Spain is not that sympathetic to Muslims. Generally, the entire nation of Spain was born out of hatred to Islam, so that kind of heritage is generally suppressed. So there are a handful of Muslims that are working on saving those manuscripts. So that's what wujada is. You find a manuscript. There's no connection with the teacher, but you just find it sometimes after the teacher's death, sometimes after hundreds of years. Are you allowed to take that and now transmit it in a formal way as transmission? So most scholars say no, because you didn't receive them from the teacher. You still can use it. It's not about using the manuscripts. This is talking about being part of that isnad. Would that be in the classical method, classical period? It would be like many books of hadith were discovered after his teacher's demise, right? So a famous example is the Musnad of Imam Ahmad has a lot of these examples. The Musnad of Imam Ahmad was compiling these hadith ongoing in his lifetime. He never completed it. His son Abdullah, after his father passed, he would often discover hadith that he had on his notes at home. And you find these hadith and he would just add them in the Musnad. So the Musnad today is basically a compilation that was completed by his son. And many of the hadith were discovered by his son and included in there. That's basically an example of wujada. So is that something acceptable or not? That's heavily debated. Generally, if you can imagine the scholars who had a very heavy emphasis on person-to-person transmission, live learning, making sure every link is sound, this would violate everything. So it wasn't a strong method of learning. Today, in today's times, coming back to modern times, this is the predominant form of learning, because most of the books are rediscovered and they're translated and published. Now people read them. So there's a rediscovery of many, many books. So we learn today through mostly discovery. All these others are more direct connections to teachers. With the rise of books now, like what do you say about a book that you just buy from a library? It's still a discovery because you're buying it from a bookstore, but you have no connection to the teacher or the teacher's student. There's no direct connection to this chain in that book. So that's the discussion I wanted to share today. So the 8 forms of learning. Any questions? Now you have all of them in front of you. Now that can make for more meaningful questions. Yes, Brother Muhammad. All types of knowledge. I mean, this is in the context of hadith, but hadith is just like any other knowledge. You can generalize them to everything else, and I think I tried doing that. In every single one of these, I tried to generalize and show how it plays out in other settings or even today. Like today, modern learning doesn't emphasize this personal connection. It's zero. Modern learning doesn't have any of this. It's only discovery. You just read a book and you learn and you come up with ideas, and you have teachers. So the teachers help you to think and things like that. So there's some element of sama', but there's no idea of qira'ah anymore. Like you don't read English books to a teacher. That doesn't happen. There's only, you can say sama'. There's no concept of permission. Permission is transplanted into what? The bachelor's degrees and the master's degrees. So now you go to an institution of learning, you pay the fees, you go through all their courses. When you pass everything, they give you a bachelor's. That's their ijazah, permission for you to tell the world that you graduated from this institution. That's their certification. So we have samara to some extent, permission. You have discovery primarily. The rest don't really play out. Yes, Imam Burhan.
The online students can hear you too.
For about maybe a month or and a half or so, I listened to PhD students reading El Bukhari. They were doing actually with El Manisi, and if that's why I asked you the question regarding Sama, and yeah, partially, but by the same token, I was thinking that, like you were saying, that it would take so much time because that class was like 4 hours in the morning, and where they would go over every bab of the Bukhari and whatnot. And and in passing, Dr. Walid al-Manisi was listening to the students and correcting them, etc., as they went through the hadith. So, but he mentioned to one student, he said, you should be teaching this, you know. So, I mean, with the teacher saying something like that, you know, is that somewhat like, if you would, the ijaza that he's giving the student in terms of his abilities, et cetera, and whatnot, and understanding all of the information and passing the information on to others?
Yeah, so you touched on a number of things. So the first issue I guess we can briefly discuss is, so now you have Samara audition sessions around the world that have been revived for books of Hadith. I guess the question would be, what is the value of that? I guess. Um, so there is some value in that, right? Like it's not entirely valueless. It's not primary learning for me, because you're not really, because so you have to understand what these sessions are. These sessions aren't learning Bukhari. You're not sitting there explaining Bukhari. Teacher's not explaining what the hadith means. If the teacher were to do that, 9,000 hadith, that would be a session that lasts like 3 years, right? But these sessions are usually over 2 or 3 days or a week or an afternoon. And people sit and they basically read the entire book of hadith to a teacher. And the teacher gives a jaza, you heard this book of hadith from me. Very little explanation or understanding. A lot of the people sitting there, they have no understanding because they don't understand Arabic. No, I know. I'm not talking about your session. I'm just now extrapolating a general discussion for everyone. So a lot of people. So the value of those is not that valuable today because there are people that chase these. There's a chapter in here about that. Sheikh Akram also shares my view, or I share his view rather. It says, slow down, O people of Riwayah. I think it's all the way at the end. Yeah, chapter 33. Maybe you can read that as well. Chapter 33. So this week you're reading chapter 13, 14, and chapter 33. So there's an ijaza chasing culture around the world where you sit and you read books of hadith. And I know people, I mean, I got involved in it a little bit, just check it out. I know people that read the Shama'il of Imam al-Tirmidhi 500 times to like teachers around the world. They just keep chasing different teachers. So there is a value to that if you understand Arabic. Every time you read, you come up with like insights, but these reading sessions are very fast. So you're not really thinking about the hadith, you're just reading really, really fast. So the way it plays out today is it's very questionable. You know, it's something that I don't see. I can't say it's entirely benefitless because for a serious student, reading a book from beginning to end has value, right? Because then you come across hadith. In some of these sessions, there are hadith that I never heard of. Wow, that sticks to your mind. But it's going so fast, you can only focus on 1 or 2 hadith, then you miss like 10, 15. But still, there's some value to reading that. There's a value to being in the company of scholars. So there's more like barakah value. It's like symbolic value. It's a value of keeping a tradition alive, but it's not real learning. It never was real learning. This is not real learning. Real learning is sitting and learning material comprehension and fahm, not the idea of reading a book without comprehension. So that's not how it is. I mean, unfortunately, that's how the society and community has gone. Even the Quran today, vast majority of the Ummah recites the Quran without meaning, and they believe it is rewardful, right? It is
Alif Lam Mim as a reward. Shaykh Akram believes there's no reward if you don't understand it. Like, so that idea that even without understanding the Quran, every single letter you're getting reward is not agreed upon. So that's something that really struck me when I learned that, because the Quran is meant to be understood. There's no evidence from the life of the Prophet ﷺ that this was something meant to be recited like a formula, like music, like magic, without meaning. All the miracle of the Quran, all its effects are in the meaning. So without the meaning, we have made it into a tradition. There's still a majority of scholars say without the meaning, you still get reward because it's the kalam of Allah, but there are scholars say no, like there's no proof for that. There's a hadith of Ibn Mas'ud. He asked, what do I get from the prayer when I was negligent in the Prophet? You only get what you were aware of. You understood. So even in prayer, if you don't understand what you're doing, yes, you have fulfilled the prayer, or how would Allah reward you for something you're not even aware of? So that's something that we need to push back on. Like we need to revive this idea of understanding and comprehension, and not just like a tradition of reciting things and like formulas and so on and so forth. So that's Samara sessions. And so then you asked, like, if the Sheikh made a comment to a student, you should be teaching this. Does that have value? Yes, I would say that has value. That's like a tazkiyah, but the only value it would have is the value of the ijaza, and the value of the ijaza itself is not that high. So to begin with, the value of the ijaza is pretty weak, but within that scope, a scholar praising a student, that has some value. Allahu a'lam. Any sisters? Okay. How did students obtain the knowledge to be granted the ijaza online from books? No, you sat with teachers. And we're discussing the classical era. You sat with teachers and you learned the material. So they didn't have books back then. Like the books came much later. And even with the books, like they were very hard to come by. You would read the books and learn the books from the teachers, even when you had them in your hand. There's no such thing as reading a book on your own and learning. That wasn't considered knowledge in the classical era. Okay.
Right, but my question was, in the later era, when you were saying that the ijaza had very little value and wasn't considered as valid, my question was how they obtained the knowledge from the teachers. Was it just reading their collections on their own?
You're
or
talking about the
reading
later period?
learning some of
like
them
today?
and then being given the ijaza by the teacher?
Are you talking about today?
No. I meant after the classical period.
Yeah, so generally the norm was you would get, like, so if you were to learn from Imam al-Bukhari, for instance, Farabri came and learned Sahih al-Bukhari from Bukhari. So he would get a copy of Sahih al-Bukhari because in this period now scholars started compiling books for the benefit of their students to make it easier for their students. So these students would purchase the books of the teachers or they would write them by hand. And then they would come to the teacher and read those books and learn the material from the teacher. And then that's where they transmitted books. Nobody would take a book and just start transmitting without seeing the teacher. There still had to be a process because these aren't books that are published by printing presses. They're published they're written by hand, and they're written on material. So there's always errors that happen. So you had to have a process of correcting that book with your teacher. So they would read these books to the authors of those books. Or sometimes, they would read the books to the students of the teachers. So now after Imam Bukhari passed, his student Farabri, people would come to him and just with the copies and read to him. Then he would sign at the end that this student heard all the hadith from me or learned all the hadith from me, and I learned them from Imam Bukhari. So it would have 2 links. And then later on, it would be 4 or 5 links to Imam al-Bukhari. Today, we have 17 or 18 links to Imam al-Bukhari if we still continue that process. Wallahu a'lam. Okay. Let us stop here then. We'll take 8:45 we'll resume for the Arba'in, inshallah. It's 8:30, 8:45. Is that good? 15 minutes? Is that too much? Okay. Those who want to pray Isha, there's a good time to pray Isha, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.